Media Galleries. Today is a very special occasion for us. I met the Segals in 2003, thanks to the urging of my colleague, Judy Lasker, the High Professor of Sociology and Anthropology. Thank you, Judy. The family suggested that I look at the work of Donald Lokuta, long-term friend and assistant to George Segal for over 16 years. We have accumulated over 10,000 black and white negatives in a creative documentary project that goes well beyond mere photography. We at Lehigh are greatly indebted to Helen Segal, Rena Segal, Susan Kuttelroth, and Donald Lokuta for their generosity, encouragement, and assistance from the very beginning of this project. Working with Donald Lokuta has been a privilege and a delight. While selecting the images for this exhibition, my understanding and appreciation of the work of George Segal have been reawakened and reinforced. Lokuta's professionalism, sensitivity, and dedication to George Segal are simply inspirational. His commitment to photography and education is notable, and generations of students have benefited from his broad and diverse knowledge. He is a professor of photography at Kane University in Union City, Union, New Jersey. We are most appreciative of Donald's generosity in making his work available and his cooperation in every step of the organization and preparation of this exhibition. I hope that you have the opportunity and go his work at Du Bois Gallery in McGuinness Hall. We thank you for being here, and I'm very happy to introduce you to Donald Lokuta.
Can the screen be raised higher?
Yeah.
Can the screen be raised higher?
No, we can't, I think. Can we? No. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry about that. Let me begin by saying I was introduced to George Segal in 1984. It's a very interesting meeting. I was introduced by one of my students, so that shows that you have to be kind to your students when you're a college professor. Michael Bergman, who became a very dear friend of mine, applied for an Arts Council grant from the state of New Jersey. I encouraged him to do that because he was an absolutely fantastic photographer. And he won. It was a miracle, he won. It was the highest grant. I asked Michael what his topic was going to be. So he said his topic is going to be to photograph the most famous artist in New Jersey. So I thought to myself, well, you know, he's going to do this all year. That'll just take probably a month or maybe a week. But anyway, I didn't say it. But anyway, I said, well, that's phenomenal. That's fantastic. Who are you going to photograph? He said, of course I'm going to photograph George Segal. And I said, you know, my ears perked up. And I thought, George Segal, of course, my hero. I read the Abrams book that was out on George. I'd seen his work. I was at the, seen his work at the Janus Gallery, phenomenal. Read the articles, and I said, that's a person I've always wanted to meet. So I said, good luck, Michael. So he finally got in touch with George. Made this phenomenal photograph, saw the photograph, he told me the stories. And not only that, when he met George, he was asked to be the model for the one of the figures in the Holocaust sculpture. And then he brought the Polaroids back that George did of him modeling. And I thought, this is the most unbelievable story I've ever heard. So I thought, I've got to meet George Segal. I just have to meet George Segal. And how am I going to do this? So I thought. Next time I saw Michael, I said, Michael, I've got to meet George Segal. He says, I don't know how I'm going to do that. And I paused and I said, Michael, if you don't get me to meet George Segal, I'll never speak to you for the rest of your life. And my humor, of course, but Michael was stopped for a moment, and he finally said, well, I hardly know the man, but he said he was going to invite me back to the studio to see the finished sculpture, and I'll just ask him if I could bring a friend. And, that was it. So I got there and I got the grand tour of the entire facility. And so what I'd like to do is show you the Segal studio and the photographs of George. As I'm doing this, since we don't have huge amounts of time, if you have any questions about any specific photograph, I'd like you to ask me now, rather than going back, right? Treat this as my class, all right? Let's see if this works. Sorry. Technology. Okay. This is George in the main part of the studio. George's studio is about 300 feet long. The front part was where all the creative activity took place, and the other rooms from 3 to 9 or 10 is where George kept his sculptures. So we're going to go through this whole thing. Let's go to the next. This is the main studio where we spent most of our time working. Oh, by the way, I should say that after meeting George, what I really wanted to do was make a photograph of George. I'm a photographer, so photographers make photographs. And my intent originally was never to do any inclusive documentary study of anybody, including George Segal. I thought it would just be wonderful to just go to the studio, make a few photographs, and maybe photograph George. And I thought that if I wound up with 2 photographs or 3, will that help? If I made just 2 or 3 photographs, I would be a happy camper. So I did that. I asked George if I could come in and make a photograph, and I did a photograph of George. It's okay. I don't even use it anymore. It looks like a copy of a Richard Avedon. And I had some other photographs. They were okay. But after a while, George and I started to chat, and I found out that he was extraordinarily interested in photography. Extraordinarily interested in photography. And 2 years before, he made an important trip to the Middle East and to Egypt, and he shared those photographs with me. So we talked about photography. I came back and we chatted, and I came back again and we chatted more. During those times, I made more photographs. I had no idea that I was going to have eventually 10 to 15,000 photographs. That was just beyond imagination. George working on a sculpture it's called Parking Garage. This is a bit of a later piece. And George is just sitting there working. The background, the image in the back is a photographic mural, which is about almost 8 feet tall, and it's in 3 panels. It must be about 10 feet wide. Shot with a 35mm camera, one of George's photographs. We eventually wound up traveling around, going to Lower East Side of New York City, Chinatown, all up and down the Jersey coast. And he photographed, I photographed. We went out on photographic excursions, trips. We made sculpture together. I found out that, well, the idea of making sculpture didn't happen the first day or 2. As I was making photographs, I found out that my photographs were rather boring, the first ones, the first couple of times I photographed George. And they looked like everybody else's pictures. The first one, like I said, looked like a kind of like an Avedon, and the others looked like I was a commercial photographer just photographing somebody, some famous artist. And finally, George was working at this table in the main gallery, and his arms were full of plaster, and he was working on one figure which was spread out across the table, and he couldn't stop. You can't stop at that point. And I came to drop off something, a photograph of him, and I asked him if I could, make a few more photographs, and I did do that, and the photographs still weren't turning out correctly. So I was frustrated, actually. I thought, there's something here that I could do a little bit better. I knew there was a barrier. I was the photographer and he was the model. And that's the way it usually is, right? So I kind of blurted out, after I was watching him work, I said, I think I could do that. Watching one of the most famous artists in the world work, it's kind of a nerdy thing to say. I didn't really mean it quite like that, so I thought he was either going to throw me out or give me this nasty look. So he sort of stopped and said, "You think you could do that?" And he says, "Put that camera down." So he just showed me how to fill one of the sculptures. He had to get it done, and I could think he needed some help. So we worked together, back and forth. We worked for hours that day. And during that time, I had my little Leica with me. During the time I would, while the plaster was drying, I would just wipe my hands and just pick up the camera and just make a few snapshots. We'd continue working, we'd be talking, and I'd put the camera down and make a few snapshots. And I'd constantly do that for hours. And at the end of the day, I had interesting photographs finally. And I thought this was like phenomenal. I'm learning about art. I'm making interesting photographs and having a ball. And again, like I said, George was deeply interested in photography. This again, there are more views here of the main studio. At first, when I met George, I was impressed by Segal's reputation, by his fame. But as I got to know George, I was impressed by his intellect, by his curiosity, by his talent, his accomplishments, by his compassion, by his drive, by his incredible sensitivity, and by his humanity. He truly was one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. Anybody who has known him will probably say that. So as we were lighting the sculpture, and I was on a ladder, I found myself up there. I left the ladder, grabbed the camera, just made a quick snapshot. I wanted the photographs to have no real boundaries. I wanted them to be like photographs of a friend, just as I would photograph any one of you if we were at a party or a family reunion or something like that. And I didn't want them to be the standard photograph that you would see where a photographer was commissioned to do a portrait of an artist in a studio. They had to be natural, and that's what I tried to do.
Always black and white?
Yes, for the most part, black and white. I thought black and white. I thought George's photographs George's sculptures were incredibly personal and psychological. They were very moving to me, and I thought black and white photography had that kind of mood. Of course, a lot of Segal sculptures are painted, as you'll see upstairs, but black and white fit my mood too, and they worked. All black and white. And mostly with that small camera. I always thought the common thread in all of George Segal's sculpture, because I knew about them before I had ever met George, was kind of a quiet, thoughtful analysis of what it meant to be human. And before I met George, I was wondering if he would be the type of person that kind of gave me this humanistic feeling when I looked at the sculpture. And indeed, it was exactly that way. It was exactly like his sculpture. This is a view of the main studio, one of his models, Wendy, and that's not the finished piece. This is a piece called Blue Woman on Bed. I believe that's something like that, Blue Woman on Bed. And You could see a couple of different sculptures in the works. What's interesting about some of the photographs is that it shows the progression and changes. Art is an evolution. For George, sculpture, it evolved as he was working on it. He very rarely did drawings or any maquettes as he was working on his work. He just did it, and it changed and changed and changed. So the photographs sometimes also document that change from the beginning to the final piece, which is, I think, fascinating for me. George said many, many times as he was making these sculptures, he said to me, at every stage of his evolution, a work of art should be convincing and should be able to stand on its own. The sculpture for the figure for the sculpture Barney's Door, Barnett Newman. This is a covered sculpture of one of the figures for Graffiti Wall. You'll be seeing the piece as it evolves, and also it's the final version at the end of this slideshow. These are just scenes around the studio. Not all the photographs are about George, they're about the studio too, about the artist's workspace. This is one of my favorite photographs. It's Helen and George. We were making, Helen and I were making, doing the casting of George for a figure in Graffiti Wall. George and I were, sometime before that, walking through the Lower East Side of Manhattan, downtown, and we saw three men, standing against this wall. They were just, one was sitting, one was standing, another was sitting on some kind of a bench, and they were just kind of watching the world go by. And George said, "Did you see that? Did you see that, Tom?" I said, "Yeah, I saw that." And he says, "I'm going to make a photograph of that, just to remember what it looks like." So he'd pass by without looking through the camera, everything was preset, he'd just make a photograph. And that was the inspiration for the sculpture. The sculpture didn't look anything like the finished piece, but it was a starting point, it was an idea. It was a substitute for a sketch.
And his photographs were always black and white, no?
Yes. Well, early on they were color. I'm sure George did some color early on a slide. But yeah, when he started to do photography, as it would say, serious photography, they were black and white. And he would use a small format camera, so 35mm. Very portable. I'd like to throw in some George quotes, some Segal quotes here. He said one time, and this was from a magazine, he said, "I sharply disagree with the argument that the more abstract a painting, the more spiritual it became. I felt that spirituality could not be achieved by leaving out the real world." And just working in the studio. As I would be walking by, I'd see an interesting scene, an interesting composition, and just pick up the camera and just shoot. I didn't use any other equipment. I used one lens, one camera, no lights, and just what was there. It couldn't be intrusive. I didn't want to destroy the moments. And I just love the patterns of the studio. I think the studio was a place George was extremely comfortable in, as you can well imagine. And I think for me it was a kind of a wonderful, magical place. One of the castings being made. the model is sort of being released from the mold. George has actually walked over to get a piece of cheesecloth so she could wipe her eyes, because you make it plaster in your eyes, but that's whimsy. This is the casting for the sculpture Blue Woman on Black Bed, which you'll see in a few more slides. That's the finished piece.
How much time was required for the model to be with the plaster before
How
that
much?
was removed?
How much? Say that again.
How long, what was the time duration for the live model to be in plaster before the plaster could be removed, the mold could be removed?
Well, this might be a little unusual, but let's just say here we're going to do a sculpture of me standing here. It would be done in 3 parts, not the whole figure, 3 parts. Probably from the waist down, the torso, and the head separate. The time from beginning to end, not counting the time that it takes to dry under plaster that he's working. We do it in 2 hours. 2 hours. But the drying time was, maybe, what was it, like 20 minutes or something? For each piece. But it would be 2 hours. But it would take several months to finish the final piece. Several months. It really depends on the complexity. But for the model, it was quick. For the artist, it was time consuming. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have another question. How did he solve the problem of when he casts a head that the model gets enough air? Did he make like a little hole with a tube, or how did he go about that?
The nostril, the opening of your nose was left.
Oh, it was left open, and then he would close it afterwards.
Left open, and yeah. So he never lost a single model. It would be hard to hold your breath for that long, though. It was a good move on his part. It was a very comfortable experience. Several people in the room have been models, and I think that most people will agree. I mean, I've been a model a few times, and it's like the plaster bandages were dipped in warm water. They're these Johnson & Johnson bandages. This is well documented in books, by the way. This is not a secret or anything. And when they're placed on your face, you feel like you're in a warm pool with your eyes closed. I mean, it's just so meditative. It's so relaxing. It's unbelievable. So that was the feeling I had. It was actually a thrill to be alive. It was a really interesting experience. In the studio, in the far corner of the studio, I call this these body parts. And through the years, when a sculpture, George wasn't sure of what he was going to do with it, or maybe it didn't even work out, he would place the pieces, the fragments, in this area. And I think that's a sculpture in itself. There's no question about it. That's a finished piece. It probably took 25 years, but it's a finished piece. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful sculpture. I just would love to have this in my house. I would reconstruct the wall and the window. It's fantastic. And thank goodness it's still there at the foundation. This is Robert Jaskowitz, a friend being cast for sculpture, Force Power Tools, F-O-R-C-E. It's a place where you would buy tools, a guy's place. George and I used to go shopping. Besides Home Depot, we went to classier places. And this is Robert Jaskowitz. He's a historian. Second. If there are any questions, just go on. The finished piece, which is the one on the left. I often thought maybe I should have done more color. That figure is, I think that one is black, that one is blue. The color is fantastic. George was a master of color.
Was the plaster colored or was the color applied later?
No, the color was applied later. It's acrylic, and the colors would be carefully mixed. And I hope you will look upstairs and see that. So the color was applied later. The photograph here is not in the main studio where most of the creative work was done. This is room 3. I don't know if the next slide will start with that, but you'll be able to see all of the rooms. These sculptures were finished and placed in another location out of the way. And there we go. That's the other side of room 3. So we're going to take you through room 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. When I got my first tour, the first time I met George, of the studio, after I got through this door and started to meander through the different rooms, I was like blown away. I just didn't know what to say. I had all these plans to say something intelligent because, you know, I read the books and I love this work and I wanted to say something meaningful, but I was like speechless. I said a few things, but it was just so overwhelming, as you'll see. I found out later on that a lot of times when George gave people tours of the entire studio, he would just sort of like not say a whole lot. He would watch their reaction as they rolled in and out between the sculptures, looking at them and stopping and going here and going there. And finally, you go through this, you know, almost 300 feet of studio, and you would like gasp and say, wow. And then you'd go back again and do the same thing backwards. It was like an incredible experience. I don't know how many people here have done that, actually seen the studio or got a personal tour from George Segal, but it's an unbelievable, memorable experience. I'll never forget the first time. But there were 100 times after that, thank God.
Did each room have its own theme?
Did it have its own theme? Well, in a way, and in a way not. Certain types of sculpture, well, of course, certain types of sculptures are grouped together because he thought they worked together. In fact, this room is an installation, isn't it? Yeah, it's an installation. There's a sculpture here, a sculpture here, here, and drawings all over the wall. But I think the whole thing works as one piece. And the entire series of rooms is one installation. I think it's one piece of art. It's an amazing piece, but it's one piece of art. There was a quote in one of the books by Marco Livingstone, and let me just read that. This is a quote from George. He says, this is about the idea of the studio, and it relates to his studio too, but what we're looking at. He says, I have to confess a subversion. I'll pay all that attention to resolving a single sculpture, but I've known for years that my real work has been setting up physical space to enter. In other words, the experience is walking through the art gallery or the museum, rather than looking at the pictures, which is an upsetting idea because we've always been riveted on the artwork. Citing the streets of Rome, the Zen gardens, etc., he concludes, there are plenty of extraordinary places in the world in which we could walk, that can completely stir us emotionally and on 12 other levels. Some nature-made, some man-made. That's the point. I feel strongly about the validity of that as a sculptural idea. Room 4, part of it, the Depression bread line. The original plaster as it sits in the studio. The studio is a wonderful, wonderful environment for a sculpture. It looks so natural there. It was born there. It was made there. I sometimes like some of the sculpture better in the studio than I do when I see it in a museum, although it looks spectacular in a museum. But when I saw some of the original pieces that I was familiar with the first time in the studio, I was just knocked out by it. And he was just thinking, we would spend a lot of time just talking about art. I was there every week, pretty much, and then during the summer, several times a week. I considered it my summer vacation. Interesting summer vacation. George, one of George's famous favorite quotes, which there are variations on, he used to say, every moment of consciousness is an incredible gift. And he lived by that. This is a woman on bench. Yes, that's Susan. I love this. I love the studio. The idea of the photographs. I like the compositions, the lighting, the geometry. This is exactly the way they were set up. When I photographed these, I didn't change the lights in any way whatsoever. This is just exactly the way it was. This is room 6. We're still moving along. Kind of imagine yourself winding through, meandering through the studio. What an experience that might be. I counted 12 or 13 sculptures just in this view alone. Sometimes one sculpture interfered with the space of another sculpture. The constructors here. This sculpture in the back is an earlier piece. It doesn't really belong to it, but it was added. It was placed in such close proximity. It looks like it's part of the same sculpture. There's another little quote. In these spaces, the sculptures were carefully placed in close proximity to each other, sometimes blurring the lines between the individual pieces. George Segal saw these rooms as large installations. When we relocated a completed sculpture to one of the rooms, he would ask if I thought it works in a particular location. In fact, all of the exhibition spaces, rooms 3 through 9, should be viewed as one large installation, one large work of art. When George gave one of his famous museum tours, as I said, he really rarely said a word and really wanted to look at your reaction, hear your questions. If you asked a question, he would answer them. He was interested in the entire experience. The next room. The geometry is great in the studio, isn't it? I mean, the lines, the spaces, the forms. We have three different, 1, 2, 3 different sculptures here. I think they work well together. And from the other side, that same view. The spaces in the studio were so packed and so complex. The lighting was set just so. Everything lit exactly the way George wanted to see it. This is room 9. We're getting back there. George has said, he said, I had walked the streets doing my private thinking, often struck by some image that later haunted me. Those were the ones I remembered and laboriously reconstructed as sculpture, building and rebuilding to mesh the geometry and proportions and reinforce the human drama. This is the scene, not quite the same scene that we saw on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, when those 3 men were just standing on the corner watching I thought watching the girls go by, but I'm probably watching the world go by. But the wall did not have any graffiti on it. The subjects were a little different, but these were images. These sculptures were about memories, about his life, about the world that as he saw it. Another George quote is, he said, "My sculptures are reflections of the emotional reality of life." Two other sculptures, also with a painting, early painting. Phyllis Tuckman says in her book, interesting quote, she says, Andy Warhol shows us our idols, Segal shows us ourselves. Outside now, prowling around on a photographic adventure. That's what we used to call them, photographic adventures. And George is photographing with 2 of his old antique Leicas in Asbury Park, New Jersey. George loved the Jersey Shore. He used to go to Asbury Park a lot, Ocean Grove. Keensburg was a favorite. He was extraordinarily serious about his photography. You remember, he had several one-person photography shows in Paris and California, at Howard Greenberg Gallery, also in New York City, and probably a few more. But we would just get in the car and just wander around. We would always, he was taking a picture of me, so I took a picture of him. There was always time to stop at a local diner. I think I could put together an entire book of George Segal at the diner. And this is in downtown by Cooper Union. A lot of people didn't know that he was that serious about photography, but he accumulated thousands and thousands of negatives, and we would actually choose the ones that he wanted printed. I would make some proofs, and sometimes we even went to the darkroom at Kean University, or mostly my darkroom at home, and we would make bricks. He made the time to do that. And just at art shows, we would make a lot of trips into New York. This happened to be the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I forgot what was showing that day, but it was George and Rena, his daughter. So we were exhausted probably, and we just sat down, and I just, being a photographer, and I had my camera, I sat in the bench opposite and just waited for the right moment and just made a photograph. Just spontaneous photographs. Again, I just wanted the photographs to be pictures of my friends. I had no intention at first of making such a large series of photographs, none whatsoever. And in fact, they've never been shown. This is the first time. And I tagged along with him when he was setting up his show at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. It was a major show, and it took several days. He was supervising the lighting, and I just came along with probably 40 rolls of film. And we spent an awful lot of time. He spent a lot of time lighting the exhibition, but we spent more time going to all the museums in town and just wandering around the city. So this is the National Gallery, and this sculpture, the dancers, the bronze, is in the National Gallery. So as soon as I saw this, I said, well, I have to make a photograph of this. When he was standing by the railing, just as he was, and I couldn't do this very quickly, as usual. Usually, I don't bother my subject, but the people were in sort of disarray. So I said, let's pretend that I'm Cartier-Bresson for a minute, and we have to wait for the decisive moment. The people in the background are in such disarray. I really have to wait for a much more interesting pattern. So we were telling jokes and kidding around, and he had the smile on his face, and finally things cleared out a little bit, and one photograph was made. And Brighton Beach, we would go to Coney Island, Brighton Beach, wherever we thought. I thought these figures could be great subjects for one of his sculptures. When we were out on the street, and I made hundreds of photographs of him, I would never look through the camera. Never. It would have to be all preset, ready to go. I would just kind of carry it at my side and just go click. I just pointed in the right direction. That's it. If it came out, it came out. I didn't want to ruin the moment. I was working with the law of averages in photography. And just at home. I don't know what we were doing, but there were obviously lichens here, and contact sheets are spread out all over the table. This is a photograph. What's his name? I'm sorry.
Hans Nemeth.
Hans Nemeth. Block. I'm sorry. What's wrong with me? It's Hans Nemeth. And George was very fond of Hans's photographs. And Hans Nemeth photographed all the great artists, And this happened to be the last artist Hans Nemeth photographed. This was George. And several days later, Hans Nemeth passed away. So we have a whole series of Hans Nemeth photographing George Segal, the very last photo session that Nemeth did. and the heads for the sculpture Depression Breadline. I think we better speed it up. And George working on the sculpture Depression Breadline. Oh no, that's the breadline. No. This is Appalachian Farm Couple. I'm sorry, the Appalachian Farm Couple. This is for the FDR Memorial. And Fireside Shack is in the background. That's also in Washington, D.C. A series of 3 sculpture groups that he did for the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial. But the most famous is the Depression Breadline. And this is one of the figures. This figure is of George. George Segal is the 4th figure in line in that sculpture.
What number are you now?
3. George always casts me in I'm a homeless person, I'm on a Depression breadline, things like that. I don't know.
Who are the other 2?
The other figures?
Yeah.
Let me just get to the, I'll name them. Okay, so that's George, Leon Bible. Leon Bible was a neighbor who lived down the street who was actually an artist who lived through the Depression and actually was the only person that would actually waited on a breadline. And so we had Leon Bible and Martin Friedman. Martin Friedman, I'm trying to remember, at the Walker Art Center, right? He was the director of the Walker, and myself, and George, and Danny Berger, who worked at the Metropolitan. So only one person was ever in a breadline. But that's my favorite sculpture. Wonder why.
Are they all freestanding by themselves?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And as you'll see in the next slide, this is not the finished piece. The finished piece. This is at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, and there's a wall behind and a door. 5 figures are waiting for the door to open. And this is also an installation photograph at the Hirshhorn Museum. We're almost done here. George said, I had one rule of thumb. If I was going to deal with an image, it had to mean something to me. The image had to stir some memory or strong feeling I had, some association I had with the object. If I didn't feel strongly about something, it really wasn't worth doing because I spent months on each piece. The installation of cinema at the Hirshhorn. And the last couple of them, that's the front of the studio, and that was George's chair. And the last photograph, this is a photograph, we were taking a break, we were wandering through Newark, New Jersey, and we found another place to eat, of course. And I'll just leave you with one quote, which I think is extraordinary. It's in Phyllis Tuckman's book, and it says, Phyllis says, in 1963, Segal mentioned how, when he was painting 6-foot by 8-foot canvases, his wife, a down-to-earth woman, would suggest he make smaller pictures that would sell more readily. George said, I would answer, what difference does it make, since I don't sell work in any style? He says, my work was, it goes on, my wife was exasperated, he said. Helen replied, if you can't sell the large images, how will you be able to sell those enormous sculptures? That wasn't important to me, Segal said, since I never imagined my art would sell. And I think that it's amazing. My entire experience working with George was a blessing. And I think it's, if I were to sum it up in just a few words, it was simply an adventure in art. Just an adventure. I don't know, are there any questions?
You have any questions?
Yes. When George walked up to someone in the street and said, will you be a model for one of my sculptures? What reaction did he get?
When he walked up to someone?
When he saw somebody he liked.
He would never walk up to somebody in the street. He would always choose a scene that he was familiar with. He would always choose a person that he knew or he was familiar with. He would never just walk up to a total stranger for the most part. He had to have met you, right? I'm pretty accurate with that. Anything else?
The fact that this dude was an art installation, did he use this kind of like communities he created within the studio that people were sculptures were somehow real to him?
Well, I'm sure they were personal to him, and he had a connection with all of them. Real to him?
It almost seemed like there was created a whole world.
The whole world.
Like a whole community. People didn't see them, they just.
No, well, but each one was different. Each one, of course, they were all about what it means to be human. I think they were just different facets of the human condition.
It was his world?
It was his world. It was about him, really. I don't think these were, he constructed this as it was his world. Doesn't every artist do that? Every piece of art is a self-portrait. My photographs are, his sculpture is, and so they're all about him. And
Yeah, a bit more literally like
When he told you to try it, was it very difficult? Like what he did?
To do what?
To do what he does. You said it's
Oh,
simple.
well, yes, well, first of all, I want to make it clear, I had nothing to do with the concept of the art. That was his. I was just like,
You stick with the art.
But, it takes practice. He was an incredible technician, too, besides being a phenomenal artist. It was a skill. It was a skill. When I first tried this, he wouldn't let me do anything that was all that serious. I couldn't make a mistake. But later on, it got to be complex, very complex. And you sort of learn the technique. But his gift was not the technique, it was the vision. There's no doubt about that.
Also, might say, point out that after casting, he reworked the exteriors and he reworked all the forms with the plaster. There was a lot of extra modeling, or not modeling, but its own kind
He did. And some of his sculpture, as you know, became very expressionistic. And it's not about doing a live cast, a real casting of a real person, so I have to be able to recognize who you are. It's not about who you are. It's who you are as a human being, not your identity. So a lot of times you really didn't quite exactly look like you did in a sculpture, but it wasn't about making portraits.
It's who you are as your role in his sculpture.
Yeah.
But it's not a portrait of you. Those are not portraits.
And even when he did a few famous people, I mean, it wasn't just about being a famous person. He did a wonderful sculpture of Senator Javits.
That was a portrait.
It was a portrait. But the thing is that it wasn't really about Senator Javits. It was about something else. It wasn't about his career in the Senate or something like this. But It was a portrait, but it was about you too, I think, and about me too. It was about the human condition.
I get the impression that he's expressing isolation, the isolation of each individual. He ever expressed that?
Well, yeah, it's about that too. It's about a lot of different things. It's about isolation. It's about aging. It's about the beauty of color, the beauty of the surface of the sculpture. So these sculptures are multi-level. I mean, his art has so many different incredible levels that you should look at. So it's not just an interesting sculpture of a person sitting on a bench. It's not that. If you stop at that, you don't get it. You have to look deeper and deeper and deeper. And when you do that, you get into all of these interesting levels and all of the things. It's about the history of art. It's also that. Because he was brilliant. He knew about the history of art. Not just one thing.
These modules were in love songs, like
if the model is pictured in a sculpture, portrayed in a sculpture with clothes, absolutely, those were the clothes that they were wearing. He didn't dress them later on.
Well, we want to thank you. I would like to mention that is another work of George right here in this gallery. That was another gift of the foundation to the High University. Is a portrait of Marisol. To me, it's a marvelous pastel. It's a very significant piece. I urge you to go and see it. And also, I invite you to go upstairs and enjoy yourself. And we have some beverage and things upstairs. And thank you for coming. And once more, I want to thank the family. My co-curator, Rena. Rena is here.